we now have the great honor, frankly, of hearing from Dr. Jennifer Sherman. Dr. Sherman is a professor of sociology and affiliate professor of the Women's and Gender and Sexuality Studies program at Washington State University. She's president-elect of the Rural Sociological Society, and we don't have time to cover her numerous awards and grants and extensive service to the profession. Suffice it to say, she's the author of numerous peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapter. Dr. Sherman co-edited the award-winning book, Rural Poverty in the United States, and is the author of two widely acclaimed books, Those Who Work, Those Who Don't, Poverty, Morality, and Family in Rural America. That was in 2009. And then in 2021, Dividing Paradise, Rural Inequality and the Diminishing American Dream. Dr. Sherman, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to take a second here to set up my screen. Okay. Can you see the slides okay? All right, I'm going to hope so.
Yeah. Yes, so right now we see the presentation mode.
Oh, you see the presentation mode. Okay, let's get you out of there. And oops, we'll try that again. Okay, we can go to there. All right, so you see the slides now?
Yes.
And still slides or?
Yeah, just the slideshow. Yeah.
Okay, that is perfect. And now I just need to move something out of the way here. And I think we're good to go. There we go. Okay. All right, so sorry about that. I want to start by just thanking everybody who made this happen today, Tim and Jen. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be here and to be able to present to you today. I do want to begin by just acknowledging that Washington State University, my employers, locations statewide, are on the homelands of Native peoples who've lived in that region from time immemorial. I myself also live on land that is the Aboriginal territory of the Nez Perce and Palouse peoples, and I just want to acknowledge that Indigenous lands were generally taken by coercive and violent acts and the disregard of treaties. And for that, we at WSU extend our deepest apologies, and we owe our deepest gratitude to the Native peoples of the Washington State region. Again, thank you so much for having me here today. Let's see if I can make the slides go. There we go. So I want to start with just a quick kind of overview of my talk so you have some sense of where I'm going today. I've been asked to sort of give an overview of my career. So that's what I have here is my talk really kind of traces my career in studying and theorizing about rural poverty. So in the talk, I'll be focusing in on kind of three major streams of my work, including my earliest work on moral boundaries and poverty in rural areas, then my later work on inequality and social divisions, and my current work on rural jail incarceration and the criminalization of rural poverty. And then I'll have a very quick summary. But yeah, that's more or less where we're going. So to begin with, a little bit about me. I am a rural sociologist. I am also an ethnographer and a qualitative researcher. And my career has been focused mostly in mountainous regions of the Northwestern United States. And this is an area that's characterized by mostly white rural communities. And in particular, I've studied several different places in which the logging and ranching industries have declined and left high unemployment and a lack of living wage jobs for men in particular. And in the wake of these kinds of changes, these communities often experience very high poverty. And I study, what that change, that loss of jobs, that poverty, what that does to communities. But I've also studied different types of inequality that have come since. So among the main findings of my work has been a sort of deep dive into some of the mechanisms that create and sustain social boundaries in the absence of clear social class differences, particularly in communities where poverty is widespread. So what I mean by that is, a lot of the rural communities I study or have been in, kind of everybody's poor. So you don't really have a class structure anymore because we've lost so many jobs. Everybody's really struggling. And a lot of what I have done, particularly early in my career, is uncover some of the ways that non-economic resources and symbolic forms of capital, so including things like social, cultural, and human capital, how those symbolic capitals structure the choices and opportunities and decisions and outcomes of different rural populations. So for those of you who are either not sociologists or just, new to these concepts, social capital really consists of resources that are provided by people in a person's social networks. And these can be both economic and non-economic resources. So we can think of social capital as things like, friends who will help you in different ways, whether it's like fixing a car or lending you money, or maybe providing opportunities. Maybe they know somebody who has a job to offer, that kinds of thing. Those are all forms of social capital. Cultural capital we think of usually as access to cultural understandings, things like art or music. It can be also, manners and what is often referred to as soft skills, knowing how to behave, but also knowing cultural references, things like that. It can also be sort of traded for, again, it might be opportunities, it might just be social networks who then have their own types of capital to offer, but various types of resources. And then finally, human capital, usually we think of as just kind of education and job skills, right? The ways in which we invest into ourselves. So all of these symbolic forms of capital have in common that they can be traded for one another usually. So your social capital might help you get ahead in school in some way, or might help you learn how to, maybe your parents have a friend who knows how to navigate the application process to college or something like that. So they can all be traded for one another, or sometimes for real capital, meaning money, through these mechanisms like jobs or help from other people. Symbolic capital structures many of the ways also, though, that in which people divide themselves and create boundaries between groups. It can also structure the ways in which populations with more resources kind of hoard them amongst themselves, often while excluding those populations with less resources. And in my early work, I uncovered an additional form of symbolic capital that I called moral capital, which is based basically in observable moral behaviors and belief systems. So it's a similar type of resource that operates often in rural communities, and it consists of things like perceptions of a person or family's moral worth, through things like their work ethic or family values and different kind of performances of family values. And this moral form of capital can similarly be traded for other forms of real and symbolic capital. So I found that it arose particularly in homogeneous high poverty settings in which there are very few other forms of distinction available, right? There's just not a lot of ways for residents to separate themselves from one another. This seems to be the setting in which this form of moral capital really flourishes. And although moral capital can become a tradable resource, it can also be a source of exclusion from labor markets if you lack it. It can be an exclusion from social networks and from both formal and informal aid for people who lack access to it. So I've illustrated in my work that moral capital can play a really important role in influencing people's decisions and behaviors, particularly with regard to things like how do you survive poverty, also with regard to what kinds of work to take on and family decisions and things like that. So throughout my career, I've paid a lot of attention to things like the roles of shame and stigma in these processes of creating or detracting moral capital from people. Okay, so that was some of my very earliest work. Later, I've looked at the roles that multiple forms of real and symbolic capital play in the social processes that exacerbate and reproduce inequality in a rapidly gentrifying rural community. And in that case, I've found that rather than improving lives for everyone, the quick influx of wealthier in-migrants often worsens the fortunes of the rural poor, further marginalizing them from labor and housing markets, as well as social networks and just sort of local power structures. And then in my most recent work, which I'll also get into today, I'm looking at the ways in which rural structural and cultural conditions impact interactions with rural justice systems, including the likelihood of and recovery from arrests. And that's a collaborative project, and we've found that social dynamics combine with rural structural dynamics to effectively criminalize rural poverty and trap the most vulnerable individuals in cycles of jail recidivism, continually locking them up for really minor offenses and misdemeanors, as I'll get into. So the rural setting in general is really important to me because it has specific cultural constraints, but also, as I'll try to show today, also very specific structural constraints. So in my current work on jail incarceration in particular, we focus a lot on this interaction between the cultural and the structural. And what we find is that the outcomes of one's experience after a criminal legal interaction hinge not only on that person's economic and non-economic resources, but also the structures of the rural communities themselves. So our research team pays a lot of attention to structural lacks in multiple areas, including what you see here on the slide, things like housing, employment, transportation, health and mental health care, support services, and addiction services, just to name a few. So even though I mostly look directly at the experiences of individuals in my work, I evaluate those in the context of rurality and place level deprivation. So basically, I look at poor people who by and large live in poor places as well. Okay, so now doing a sort of deeper dive into the three main projects that, and then there's been lots of side ones along the years, but these are sort of the three main projects that make up my body of work. My first real explorations into rural poverty came from ethnographic research that I conducted in a very remote community in Northern California that I called Golden Valley. And all the names of places and of people that I'm going to give you today, they're all pseudonyms. And that's mostly because I work in these very small communities in which everyone is pretty well known to everybody. So it's really just about trying to protect the privacy of the places and the people. But so Golden Valley, it is a real place, just not the real name. It was the subject of my first book, Those Who Work, Those Who Don't, Poverty, Morality, and Family in Rural America. And this initial fieldwork really influenced my understandings of the cultural world of rural America. So Golden Valley was this very remote community in the mountains that was both really small and mostly white. It had been historically dependent on the timber industry, mainly logging and sawmills. And in the mid-1990s, due to a combination of industrial and environmental changes, the industry completely collapsed in the region, resulting in the loss of most of the men's jobs and the closing of its last and largest sawmill. So by the time I did my fieldwork there in 2003, 2004, Golden Valley was totally devastated with really high unemployment and high poverty and just a general lack of men's jobs in particular. And this was a really traditional place where, you know, until very recently, women just hadn't really worked. I spent a full year living there full time. Over that period of time, I conducted 55 in-depth interviews and a full year of participant observation, ethnography, basically, to learn about the impacts of this job loss on men, on their families, and on this larger community. This fieldwork, I have to say, was pretty difficult on a number of levels, and I learned a lot about both ethnographic research and remote rural communities doing it. When I moved there, I was, you know, sort of early career. This was my dissertation work. I was reasonably young. I was on my own for this with almost no local connections. So a lot of my work there was just about getting people to get to know me, to trust me enough to talk to me on tape. And, you know, it really influenced how I do my research, this early project, and I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A. But in my 2009 book and several related articles, I unpacked the social world of Golden Valley, right? As I mentioned, almost everyone there was white and poor, meaning that there were few sources of difference or distinction in the community, but people still found ways to distinguish amongst themselves. And I discovered that in this situation, morality and moral discourses, right? Discourses around who's moral and who's not, really played important roles in creating and sustaining these distinctions. So I found that discourses around work ethics helped to distinguish between what they thought of as the hardworking versus the lazy poor, regardless of whether individuals even had paying jobs. But really self-sufficiency was a key part of this understanding of being hardworking. Morality became key to sorting processes by which jobs, community help, and other resources were allocated in the community. I also found that discourses around family values helped people create that moral capital through being sort of like good families, quote unquote, and it also helped them to protect themselves. It was part of their way of defining kind of unacceptable family behaviors, which included things like abuse or substance use, right? That was kind of not a family value. And so it allowed women in particular to sort of protect themselves from some of the worst outcomes of male unemployment. And I also found that these discourses around family values further helped out-of-work men to create new definitions of masculinity that were built not around this identity as a logger necessarily, but around flexible parenting roles and like a focus on active parenting. And I noted in this work that when morality existed as this tradable form of capital, it became both economically and socially rational for people to adhere to its tenets. So in the book and a related article, I illustrated how it worked, along a sort of continuum, sorting people from most to least moral forms of coping with poverty. So as you can see on this slide, paid work is understandably sort of the most acceptable form of survival. The most obvious evidence of you being hardworking was the fact that you had work, but also acceptable were things like unpaid work, right? Subsistence work of various kinds, whether it was hunting and fishing for food or gathering your own wood or growing a garden. All of those were considered a form of work and again, sort of illustrated your hardworkingness. But also acceptable were things like getting help from friends and family who had jobs, as well as forms of aid that had a clear link to a work history. So in this case, unemployment insurance, but also disability benefits, because most of these men who had worked in logging had been disabled at some point. And so getting disability suggested that you had some sort of work history and work past, but it wasn't considered anywhere near as good as paid work, sort of on this continuum from most to least. On the other hand, those activities on the negative side of the divide here decreased a person's moral capital. They decreased that tradable amount of moral capital and just generally were considered very shameful as well. So doing things like getting welfare or engaging in illegal activities came at both a personal and a financial cost, right? It both would close other doors, right? It would mean you didn't get access to other opportunities and that you felt a lot of shame and stigma. And I'm just going to read now a couple of quotes that illustrate both the ways in which residents talked about their own work ethics and the shame of aid and the sacrifices that they often made to prove themselves morally upstanding. So first I have Joyce and George Woodhouse. They were a couple in their 50s who were unemployed and living below the poverty line. George said, "We don't try to get food stamps or welfare or anything like that. I mean, basically, we probably could, but I don't know. We were always brought up that you worked for what you got. You didn't have welfare and stuff like that. If you didn't work, then you cut back on what you was eating until you got a better job." And Joyce's wife said, "It's embarrassing." And then here we have another couple, a much younger couple, Liza and Tommy, who have sort of low income jobs. And again, here in this quote, you'll see both the assertion of self-sufficiency and work ethics and the sense of pride in being able to take care of yourself and the shame of asking for help. So Liza was talking about how they'd survived on low incomes, and she said, "We just kind of made it on our own. And yeah, every now and then you miss a bill and the collector will call, but we always catch back up eventually on our own." And Tommy said, I'm not real into handouts. If my family needs them, I'll take them, but I'd rather not. I'd rather work an extra job or work a couple extra days or something and take care of them myself. But that's just the upbringing I have. And I found that choices like these often paid off for families because showing your moral capital in these kinds of ways generally led to increased opportunities in the community, including greater access to job opportunities, as well as informal help from others in the community. So the larger community tended to mobilize to help those in need when they were considered morally righteous, but they would often abandon those who were seen as lacking moral capital. And I followed up on the book by continuing to investigate the roles of morality in structuring the lives of the rural poor in a few different ways. In subsequent work, I explored how rural community understandings of entire families as moral or not impacted their children's treatment in school. So I found that children who were seen as being from good families, in quotes, were more likely to receive help and encouragement in the schools and to go on to pursue education or job training outside of the community, while those who were considered to be from quote unquote bad families were ignored and neglected in school, and then they were less likely to leave the community, but more likely to struggle there to find any kind of work as adults. And I also looked at how moral understandings around things like work ethics and deservingness and shame influenced poor families' choices regarding which forms of aid, like welfare or food aid of various forms, to accept when they were in need. And this later work was actually not from Golden Valley, but an agricultural community in Washington state. So took a while, but eventually I got the chance to undertake another sort of large in-depth ethnographic study in a new rural community in the Northwest, which faced a new set of challenges. So my 2021 book, Dividing Paradise, was not exactly a sequel to Those Who Work, but it was kind of in direct conversation with it. And in this book, I investigated the community that I called Paradise Valley in Washington state, which had a pretty similar past to Golden Valley, but a very different present. So Paradise Valley is also a small, mostly white, remote mountain town in the Northwest. Like Golden Valley, Paradise Valley had experienced a collapse in the timber industry upon which it had also really depended. And like Golden Valley, it lost its last sawmill a little bit earlier, in this case in the 1980s. But the big difference between these two communities was that Paradise Valley was in a much more desirable location, closer to developed outdoor amenities like hiking and skiing, even though it was still pretty remote. It was thus able to transition to a much heavier reliance on tourism and amenity migration. It was a really popular vacation destination, and over time it drew second home owners, retirement migrants, and eventually younger working age migrants from cities like Seattle and Portland who wanted to live a sort of more rural lifestyle, closer to outdoor sports and amenities and things like that. But this demographic change, right, this in-migration of new folks created a really split community with working class old timers who'd been there a lot longer, and these middle class newcomers who had a lot more advantages in both real and symbolic resources. So unemployment wasn't as high in this community, but the jobs were clustered in low-paying sectors, things like retail, right? That because of the tourism industry, as well as construction, because you needed people to build houses for all these in-migrants and people buying second homes and things like that. And these are jobs that are non-unionized, they're seasonal, they're part-time, and they're low wage. So as with my previous book, I spent close to a year living in Paradise Valley full-time. In this case, I did a combination of 84 in-depth interviews and, again, sort of full-time ethnography and participant observation. So as you might have guessed, those newcomers, those middle-class folks, had most forms of capital than the old timers. They had much more education on average. So you see here, 74% of them had a BA or higher versus just 8% of the old timers. And this contributed to their higher incomes and wealth, as they did also their urban backgrounds. Often they had property they could sell in cities that was worth way more than property in this rural community. And these forms of capital, right, having more social capital, cultural capital, financial capital, human capital, all of that contributed to their just ability to survive in this place. It all was tradable for each other. It helped them create more social capital in Paradise Valley. Their social networks tended to be robust and supportive, with lots of resources of time and material goods to share. They often, they would help each other out with childcare because they tended to have more flexible jobs, but they also had, tractors that they would loan to each other. They would help with major chores like building barns or planting gardens, but they had a lot of all the types of resources, versus the old timers had just less of all of these forms of capital due to their mainly working class origins and much more limited experiences. The one form of capital that the old timers still tended to have access to was, of course, moral capital, which they tried to claim in very similar ways to the residents of Golden Valley. So they similarly relied very heavily on both discourses and specific behaviors that were meant to build and illustrate their moral values and family values and work ethics. Right, there was a lot of discussion of not asking for help from anyone. They talked a lot about the values of self-sufficiency and shame and asking for help in really similar ways. But in this case, we have these newcomers who have all these other forms of capital, which is kind of, they tended to ignore these claims to moral capital, and they just failed to recognize it as a tradable resource. And they just tended to judge the old timers as morally flawed anyways, based mostly on their poverty and sometimes receipt of aid or things like that. So they tended to ignore structural inequalities in the labor market and beyond, and instead held the old timers individually and personally responsible for their own disadvantages. So the newcomers who had all the resources tended to imagine the old timers as all ignorant and drug addicted and criminal. They tended to conflate poverty and unemployment with a lack of morality or work ethic. And since they seldom really mixed socially, they didn't know the old timers well, and all those performances and discourses around morality and work ethics went unnoticed by these newcomers, these, who now had a lot more power in the community. And I refer to this tendency to be blind to their own advantages and to their impacts on the less advantaged population around them as class blindness. And this is a concept that's kind of similar to the concept of colorblind racism, right? The idea is similarly a failure to acknowledge, in this case, social class privilege, and to, just be unaware of the unequal access to power and opportunities that privilege creates. And this class blindness ultimately undermines empathy and compassion for other people's struggles and sort of weakens abilities to help. So for the old timers, the result was that their moral capital really had no exchange value in Paradise Valley. And instead it became this kind of empty boundary that went mostly unrecognized. The newcomers neither valued it nor recognized it, and they focused instead on other forms of symbolic capital and real capital that they had in abundance. But even though the newcomers didn't notice it, for old timers, moral capital continues to be really important and to structure their lives and their choices in really similar ways as it did for those folks in Golden Valley. And here we see in this next quote that I'll read very similar claims to morality and a similar sense of shame and stigma around accepting help, very similar to what was seen in Golden Valley. So people really tried to show themselves as hardworking and moral, even when it meant going without help when they needed it. So Pam Rhodes, who was a service worker, said, "You just try to do well and do right by your people and live as honest a life as you can, and, try not to be a burden." And that's the other part. We don't ask for help. That's what this community doesn't do. I asked, "And what keeps you from asking for help, do you think?" And she told me, pride, and ability. You don't want to give it up. You want to be able to do as much as you can, But as I said, rather than recognizing these moral codes, the newcomers who rarely knew them well or interacted with them much just tended to judge the old timers as moral failures because they were poor. And this allowed newcomers to justify excluding those old timers from jobs and housing and social circles, thus denying them access to other forms of capital as well. So here's a young newcomer who explained to me, if you actually grew up here and you can't find work, then you're a drug addict or you have a reputation of not being a good worker. But interestingly, job opportunities, of course, went first to those who seemed most like the newcomers, right? Other newcomers. those people with social connections and higher education and specialized skills. They hoarded those jobs amongst themselves and then assumed that anyone who couldn't find a job easily must have a moral flaw. So moral capital really diminished in importance as these newcomers devalued it relative to other sources of real and symbolic capital, and they questioned old-timers' claims to it, leaving the old-timers with very few options to get ahead or even just kind of hang on in this community. And through this work, I explored multiple ways in which this community division created and replicated inequality. And I discovered that the newcomers' combination of real and symbolic capital gave them really distinct advantages in navigating multiple types of challenges, related to living in a remote rural community. So the newcomers relied on human, social, and cultural capital to secure the region's best jobs, right? They had skills, they had friends who had jobs to offer. They also relied on wealth, income, and social capital to secure the best and highest quality housing in the region. They relied on social capital, income, and wealth to navigate childcare challenges and to achieve work-family balance through flexible work schedules. And they were more socially integrated. They had greater access to informal aid. They had more social power due to their combination of social and cultural capital, right? They were connected to people with more resources to share, so they got more out of their social connections. And finally, their children had better access to educational opportunities at school and beyond, due again to this combination of income and wealth, but also social, human, and cultural capital. And meanwhile, the old-timers' relative lack of all of these forms of real and symbolic capital put them at a severe disadvantage in all of these realms. So in addition to the findings I've just sort of run through quickly here, I have explored several other issues through analysis of Paradise Valley and my qualitative research there. Some other work that's come out of this research has included pieces that look at some interrelated concerns, including there was one article that argued that while income is a significant factor in determining access to stable and affordable housing, symbolic resources, including social, and in this case, also moral capital, played significant roles. So moral capital did still appear to operate in regards to housing, particularly amongst the old timers. And this paper illustrates how a lack of financial, social, and moral capital combined to really disadvantage those old-timer residents in their struggles to procure safe or stable housing. It finds that in the rural context where in-migration has led to this high inequality, socially marginalized residents are going to face a distinctive set of challenges and disadvantages that magnify housing instability and really deepen exclusion and precariousness. I also have another piece with co-author Kai Shaft that investigates schools as a local institution that can provide, again, social, cultural, and educational privilege to some students, but also systematically withhold that privilege from others. And we find that this rural gentrification, does bring all sorts of new resources to historically struggling places like Paradise Valley, but it also exacerbates existing inequalities and creates all sorts of new ones. So rather than improving educational access and experiences for all students, we found that in this case of high inequality, educational resources were not equally distributed. And these dynamics work through sort of both informal sorting and judging mechanisms, right? Social sorting among the kids themselves, but also kind of teacher expectations. But it also worked through structural mechanisms, things like pay-to-play fees and elite curricula in the schools. And finally, one other piece that the book actually investigates that I just wanted to mention quickly is the way in which inequality exacerbates political and cultural divides and results in divergent worldviews. And in the book, I explore some of the blind spots and mythological understandings of both the liberal newcomers and the more conservative old timers. Okay, but I want to get on to my most recent work. Since 2020, I've been working with a collaborator, quantitative criminologist, Jennifer Schwartz, on a study aimed at answering the question, why are rural jail incarceration rates rising while they're falling in urban and suburban areas of the US? And this is multi-methods research that consisted of first securing participation of sheriff's departments in 6 rural counties in eastern Washington state. and then conducting quantitative, that's her side, quantitative analysis of booking data from rural county jails in 5 of the 6 counties. And then my side was conducting qualitative interviews with, so far, I've completed interviews with 37 formerly incarcerated individuals and 14 jail staff members from all 6 of our participating counties. The jail staff participated in a series of focus groups as well, in addition to the in-depth interviews. And this is grant-funded research that is ongoing. So the first 2 years were supported by a grant from the Vera Foundation of Justice. And we've recently received an additional 3 years of grant funding from the National Institute of Justice. And with this new funding, we are collecting additional data, both on the quantitative and the qualitative side. But we're also doing a lot of on-the-ground outreach with stakeholders in our counties to actually address some of these issues and try to interrupt some of these cycles that we're documenting. So in this project, obviously the findings are preliminary, but so far point to the importance of rural social and structural conditions in contributing to cycles of recidivism, right, returning to jail. And we note things like the importance of a person's social standing and social integration in helping them either recover from an arrest or get sort of sucked into the system. And here again, things like social and moral capital seem to play a really important role. So if your community sees you as an upstanding citizen, your experiences in the local criminal legal system can be much, much easier than if they've already branded you as sort of a bad person. We also note problems connected to small town surveillance, including the use of social media, local newspapers, and police scanners, which can kind of amplify the impacts of an arrest for individuals. But we've also been paying a lot of attention to lacks of things like transportation, health, and mental health care access, and justice infrastructure, things like defense attorneys, but also little things like technology for alerting people about their court dates. All of this contributes to cycles of recidivism that trap people and undermine their lives and livelihoods and housing and health and personal relationships. So we're also in this project paying particular attention to the role of really minor charges, so both monetary and non-monetary charges that trap people in the system and just bring them to jail over and over again. And these include charges like failing to appear in court, failing to pay fines and fees, failing to complete conditions set by the court, and driving with a suspended license. Together, this set of relatively minor charges serves to criminalize rural poverty to a large degree, and it makes it much, much harder for people to keep their jobs and keep their housing and to finally, just pay off all those fines associated with a jail stay. So for vulnerable residents, these types of charges can really destabilize their lives and create cycles of recidivism that are extremely difficult to escape, as I'll show sort of briefly here. So here I'll give you a few more quotes. This comes from one of our formerly incarcerated individuals explaining how small town surveillance can serve to entrap individuals with low social standing and make it hard for them to move on after an arrest. He said, so the cops know you, they know you by name, they know your vehicle, and they don't need a reason to pull you over. They're going to. If they see you driving and they know that rig because it's a small town, they are going to pull you over with or without cause. It is illegal for them to do that. It's called profiling, but in a small town, they don't care. They're going to. And this small town surveillance didn't just come from law enforcement. It could work in multiple ways, right, in the criminal legal system itself, but also at the community level to brand individuals as like quote unquote bad people after an arrest or some other moral infraction. So Alan Robbins explained, I really think that there's a lot more of a personal touch here, you know what I mean? There's just a lot fewer people, but at the same time, it is, everybody is up in your business, so it's a lot harder to succeed. Somebody gets upset with you or gets angry with you, I live in a town of 500 people. If I do something, somebody across the street has already talked to somebody down the street about it. So, I mean, everybody knows everybody. It's just, once they get your number, they don't lose it type of scenarios. They are just, it just gets to be, you are just that guy, regardless if you ever make any changes or not, you are always going to be just that guy. Modern media, including social media and local news outlets, often help to further amplify this type of local stigma. So Christy Jones here explains, the county posted the story of my arrest on Facebook, and they made me sound like a gangster. I mean, they made it sound like they found all these drugs and all this money, they made it sound like I was really going hard and, into large quantities and large amounts of money and things like that. And so that's what they posted on Facebook and on the town radio news and the daily paper. I mean, just like every possible social media news avenue, they posted the story. And these issues often combined with the structures of rural communities to trap people in these cycles. Often they faced additional challenges due to the rural setting, including lack of transportation to get to their jobs or court or work crew or other court required activities, which could be exacerbated by the loss of a license, which often happened following an arrest. So here's Clay Nash again, explaining 90% of people that go to jail that I've met there aren't pieces of shit. They want to do better. They want to have a better life. But when you get in their system deep enough, you can't. You can't get a decent job. If you can't get a decent job, how do you pay to get your license back? If you can't get a license back, you can't get a decent job. It is this downward spiral effect that is really hard to hit the brakes, and it is really hard to stop. So these types of failures to comply with court requirements and inability to pay related legal system fines often meant that people returned to jail over and over for really small misdemeanors connected to their initial arrests rather than new criminal activity, right? So they weren't going back over and over because they kept doing the same thing wrong. It was because they couldn't get out of the system once they were in it. And interestingly, our justice staff members, right, the staff that worked in the sheriff's departments, did not generally see things from this perspective. And most of them believed that their jails were full of bad people who were committing the same crimes over and over again, rather than that they were just struggling to recover from often just a single arrest on a more serious charge. So they often referred to their jails as revolving doors that caught the same bad people over and over and over again for the same crimes. So here's a jail superintendent who told me, I'm sure that everybody that's here would agree that the influx of drugs and the change in the inmates' behavior since had a huge impact on our ability to do our job. And it's just a never-ending cycle and a revolving door. They get lost and keep coming back over and over and over again. So this research is going to continue to investigate these interactions between poverty, rurality, and extreme types of vulnerability. We're also beginning, as I said, to work to stop cycles of recidivism by addressing some of these social problems on the ground, right? Some of the problems people face, we want to try and address them before they end up in jail, as well as providing more support at the community level upon release. So in that work, we are partnering with stakeholders in healthcare and mental health and support services and the legal system to help decrease jail incarceration in rural Washington state. Okay, so to just kind of summarize here, to summarize my career as a rural sociologist, I guess, my main contribution, I think, has been in theorizing the interactions of structural and cultural constraints in rural US communities and documenting the ways in which moral capital can structure the social and cultural worlds of the rural poor. And I find that moral understandings and moral discourses do sometimes form the basis of this tradable symbolic capital that can be a valuable resource for the rural poor. But in settings of high inequality, its role is more complicated and more ambivalent, and it can just as frequently become a barrier to survival and opportunities, and in the case of the jails, even freedom. More generally, my work investigates the social dynamics of rural communities, including the economic and non-economic ways in which small communities often divide themselves. And I find that these community level divisions often exacerbate the impacts of economic strain and inequality and increase the vulnerability and struggles faced by the most marginal populations. While rural communities can come together to support their vulnerable residents, and I think that's a lot of the mythology around rural communities, is that everybody helps everybody, they just as frequently can exclude vulnerable residents from both formal and informal opportunities. And these dynamics are often further exacerbated by structural lacks in rural communities, including community level lacks of resources and infrastructure and formal support services. And finally, I have argued and continue to argue that without understanding the cultural and moral universe of cohesive rural communities and the structural context in which they operate, we can't make policies that are going to impact them in expected ways, nor can we succeed in helping them improve their lives and just improve communities more generally. So I'm going to leave it there. And here's just a last slide, just a list of the references that I cited in this talk, if you're interested. But I just want to say thank you again for having me today and for your time.
All right, thank you so much. I think Jenna's got, there we go. So we had several questions come in during the talk. Others, you feel free to add to it. So the first one was, how did you effectively build rapport? In this case, it was offered early on Golden Valley, but I'm sure the same would be true for Paradise Valley. How did you build rapport with those residents in sort of a natural, authentic way?
Yeah, that was the hardest part for sure when I first got there. And I think I first thought of myself as more of an interviewer, because that was sort of how I was trained. Was I was just going to go in and I was going to ask people questions and they were going to answer. But it turned out in a rural community, it was really hard to get people to trust you enough to agree to just sit down and talk to you on tape. And so, I got some people early on. There are some people that are just naturally extroverted or friendly, but what I found was that ethnographic work that I do in these communities is really, really key. Not just, I don't think of it as key to recruiting per se, but to just building trust and getting to be known. And so in Golden Valley, I was bored, basically. I couldn't get enough interviews to keep me busy. So I just started volunteering because I like doing that. And I worked at a family support center, and I worked at the local library, and I worked at a place that was sort of working on economic development issues, and just got to know people that way without really an agenda for them. And eventually realized, like, oh, this is really, really important data too. I'm learning so much more about people, but that really helped and made connections. I got to know people, I made friends, and that sort of built outwards. Once you got to know people, then you had more opportunities to engage in more things in the community. And over time, I just had to be patient, give it that kind of time. But there were people that I had asked to do an interview early on that had said no or just blew me off, that later would come around and say, are you still doing those? Like, because my cousin did it and he said it was really fun. And if you're still interested, actually, I'd like to talk to you now. And but it really was just sort of time and getting to know people and just recognizing, like, yeah, the sort of techniques that might work somewhere else are not going to work in these kinds of communities.
Yeah. That's great. Could you share more about how a lack of men's work reshaped perceptions of masculinity? How did this manifest in behavior?
Yeah. I guess I didn't get into that much in today's talk. I had a whole piece on that where I was really looking at, this intense blow to masculinity, to lose a job, right? For men who, for generations in particularly in Golden Valley, had seen themselves as, like, they were manual laborers. They worked in the woods, they worked in the sawmill. This is who they were, this is what they did, this is who their dads were, this is what their dads did. And they saw themselves as, their role in life was to be providers for their family. And so the loss of those two things, the actual, like, the hard work that they could do every day and feel dirty and tired at the end of it, and the loss of that provider role, both of those things were incredibly devastating to their sense of self. And I found that there were sort of two different ways that they coped. On the one hand, there were what I called the rigid men, who were like, I'm going to, figure out how to just, like, force this situation. And they would often refuse to let their wives work, try to, pretend to be that same hardworking man. They would do a lot of subsistence work often and find ways to be hardworking still, but often they were really, really struggling. And in the process, they were creating a lot of tensions within the family because, the wives were often pretty frustrated because they lacked money. The guys weren't around often. They had to travel long distances to find this kind of work. And they were, struggling financially. And these women are like, I can work, I can help, just let me. But the men would, frequently do things like not only not let them work, but deny them access to any money of their own, and just, sort of really, really force them into that old traditional gender roles when it didn't really fit the situation anymore. And then there was a whole other set of guys that were much more flexible and just kind of were like, well, we wanted it this old way, but, like, it doesn't work anymore. So she's working, she's making more money, and, I'm helping around the house more. And they would they weren't really doing the same kind of housework as women, honestly, but they were doing more at home. They were active parents. They talked a lot about, it's really important for me as a man to be there for my kids in these manly ways. I teach them how to hunt and fish, and I go to their sports matches. So they just found sort of masculine ways to be active parents. And those couples were doing much, much better on average. They tended to be a lot happier. The women were just much more content, and the men often were too. They felt much better about themselves because it was a much more achievable form of masculinity. Like they could actually be there for the kids. What they couldn't do was be these providers anymore. And so that was super hard.
Yeah. Let's see. So another student asked, you mentioned that moral capital appeared in communities that were mostly homogenous. In communities that are not as homogenous, how relevant is moral capital in comparison with the other forms of capital?
In my research, it seemed much less so, like almost, everywhere that I've been since, it does seem that if you have access to all the other forms of capital, moral capital is like the last one to develop. And I've really only found it in these very homogenous places where there's just kind of no other form of distinction. So those moral discourses can exist, sort of like as they do in Paradise Valley, without really being tradable for anything. But for it to be really tradable, it seems to be kind of like a capital of last resort, honestly. So I have been in, certainly in urban areas, I don't see the moral capital come up at all. And in rural areas, it doesn't always trade. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And it does seem to be a question of like, what other forms do you have access to? The other ones are much more mainstream.
Mm-hmm. And let's see, next one. Can you speak about how morality and moral capital intersects with schooling? Does outmigration of good students produce a risk to the community's sustainability?
Yeah, in a nutshell, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the sort of the tragic pieces of the work I've done on education is discovering this, that like, the sort of the moral hierarchy does mean that, I think one of my articles is entitled like sending off all your good treasures, right? Like, that the best and the brightest, or at least the students that the community has branded the best and the brightest, are the ones that are there. All the investment goes into those kids, and then they leave. And they rarely come back because, especially a place like Golden Valley, there's no opportunities for kids with higher education. Very seldom do they return. And so you are often just, creating this selective out-migration of the people with the most resources and the most things like human capital, the most education are leaving. In a place like Paradise Valley, it was interesting because it was like, not only were sending off those kids while keeping the others, but there was also this desire to bring in people like them, to replace them with other newcomer with similar, with like high levels of education and training. So there was this sort of in both communities, but particularly in Paradise Valley, a real just prejudice against the local kids who didn't out-migrate. So it's not only that you're, taking a whole bunch out, but then the ones that get left behind, nobody wants them. Everybody's like, oh, if you stayed, then you're not worth anything, right? You should have left. But those processes start really, really early in the schools. And I have many interviews with, local educators talking about just like, there are some kids that are good and there are some kids that are bad, and they're bad because what their parents do, that they've been on welfare for generations, that, that kid's just not going to amount to anything. And they make these judgments while these kids are still really little. And often, these are kids that want to learn and want to engage in school, but after, years and years and years of being kind of neglected, they often just give up.
Yeah.
I'm gonna stop.
See, another person asked, how might gender identity and political beliefs affect moral capital in rural communities?
Gender identity and political beliefs. The political piece is sort of easier to answer simply, which is that, moral capital certainly seems to be thrives in places that are a little bit more conservative. And I don't know that that's necessarily required, but it's more that the conservatives, the Republican Party, particularly a decade or so ago, but still, they put a lot of energy into harnessing morality as a political football. They recognize that this exists, and they spend a lot of time playing to that, and they, talk about themselves in those very moral terms, which the Democrats rarely do. So it does tend to appeal, and that was one of my arguments in Those Who Work, Those Who Don't, is that, if Democrats want to win over these rural populations, they need to speak their language and recognize that this is a currency in these kinds of places. And as long as you just ignore it completely, you're going to have a harder time really connecting with those individuals where this is what matters the most to them, because it is their most available form of tradable resource. In terms of gender identity, I'm not sure that I have much to say about that from the most recent work. So we're talking the earlier work where I was looking at masculinity and things like that. And it didn't seem to play a huge role, right? Whether they were sort of the more rigid guys or the more flexible, what was important was just demonstrating work ethics and family values. And there were multiple ways to do that. And in some ways, the family values discourse allowed for sort of more flexible gender understandings, or at least newer ones, to arise, because it did give people the space to say, well, I won't stay with that guy because he's doing things that are not family values, right? And when their own moms would have stuck with the abusive man or things like that. So it gave them a little bit more wiggle room to protect themselves. But I didn't find that, that a man who was more flexible was less likely to have moral capital or anything like that. And generally the flexible ones were doing better, so they had more moral capital. But the rigid guys, if they were able to make it work, they could also, really demonstrate their work ethics and stuff like that.
Yeah. Have you had a chance to keep up with the two communities and have a sense of how COVID affected them?
Yes, definitely much more so Paradise Valley than Golden Valley. I've been back to Golden. It's just so far. That place is, I live in Washington. Well, I live in Idaho, but I basically am in Washington State. So Paradise Valley is a lot closer to me, and Golden Valley is a full day and a half's drive. It's a long way away, and it's so remote. I've been there once since COVID, and I've been to Paradise Valley many, many times since COVID. So I'll speak to that place first. It exacerbated everything. So for a community like Paradise Valley that's experiencing in-migration and gentrification, COVID was just devastating in the sense that, so many urban people were like, I need a second home in the country. I need to get away, right? I can work remotely. So gentrification just exploded there. They're experiencing a lot of new problems in terms of the housing, which was already bad, but it's just insane. By the middle of 2020, I was already hearing that, rents are higher than local wages in the low wage jobs, which is most of the jobs. So basically, if you don't have some sort of family wealth, nobody could live independently on low wage work. And they are experiencing the kinds of problems a lot of places are complaining about, where they can't keep a stable workforce because people, the people you need to wait tables and clean hotel rooms can't afford to live in the community, and it's so remote that they can't afford to, they just can't afford the gas to commute in and out on those low wage jobs. So you see places closing and open limited hours and things like that. So it's impacting the tourism industry and the community. But at the same time, there's just it continues just rush on housing. So housing, there's tons new being built, every open space is getting built up, but at the same time, the values of it are through the roof, and just a regular house is $1 million at this point, and it's sort of moving from gentrification to hyper gentrification at this point. Golden Valley is really, really different. Golden Valley is in the Emerald Triangle. And so, I really, like I said, I don't get to get there very often. I knew that the pot industry and legalization had really changed things there. But that industry has been so hit or miss in rural California. It really seems to have devastated communities. It was not what I expected. So, things look a lot worse in Golden Valley than they did when I was there, and they weren't great when I was there. They're also being more heavily impacted by climate change. Both of these communities are dealing with climate change issues and being in fire zones in these mountainous regions, but Northern California is much more highly impacted, and just much drier, lack of water, things like that are really big problems in that region, which they're not yet in Paradise Valley. So there's, people are leaving because their wells are running dry, the hillsides are dry and they burn too easily. But yeah, it's just, there's even, there's fewer, there were 2 grocery stores when I lived there, now there's 1. There's fewer businesses, there's fewer opportunities, and it does seem like, for whatever reason, pot has been maybe mostly extractive of industries, but also, legal growers just can't make it work. And it's, they put a lot of resources into legal growing only to discover it's just not penciling out in California.
Yeah. All right. So last question, and then for everyone, we'll take a break and come back at 11:15. And I think this, in some ways, will bridge to that panel at 11:15, which is of Shamokin, Pennsylvania community leaders talking about sort of collaboration and community revitalization. What you alluded in your work that you're talking about, in the work on recidivism, trying to break that cycle and, collaborating with others. I was wondering if you could just share, what are some of the, challenges, or just in terms of, maybe lessons for building, that collaboration? How do you seek out partners, build trust, and what are some of the challenges?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting process. Because from the start, we would talk to, we talked to the sheriff's department, and then we talked to people in healthcare, and, we talked to people in social services, and they all tell us the same problem from different perspectives, and they all blame each other for it. And we realized pretty early on that, like, part of what's going on here is, like, you all are not talking to or collaborating with each other, that there are some simple solutions to this, where they would say, if only, like, the healthcare people would just do X, and the healthcare people would say, if only they would just, like, give us access, or if only they would tell us when they released somebody, we could be there. There's just a lack of communication. So the first hurdle has really been to get these people that are sort of historically think of themselves as antagonists to sit down at one table and come up with these, what we can kind of see as, like, well, relatively simple solutions. That's part of the story. I think also just, getting people to want to be involved in this, I think, has been a challenge. So in terms of, there's a lot of social service providers that are like, well, we don't want to align ourselves with, like, a criminal population. And so a lot of our work has been kind of educating them on, like, who we're talking to, that, like, this, the people we're talking about, mostly are pretrial, have never been charged formally. A lot of them, most of them have never, actually gone to prison. Some of them have, but, like, jail is just the front door. Jail is just, like, when you do something little, you go for a weekend or something. And it's been really understudied. Usually we think about prison when we're thinking about incarceration, but what we found is that these little jail experiences can destabilize your life in a really intense way, but that doesn't mean that you're a criminal. And a lot of the sort of the moral end of that project is all these people talking about, like, I'm not a bad person, I just, like, made one mistake. So, some of what we do is just working with people to kind of think through, like, who are we talking about? And, it doesn't, having gone to jail for any period of time doesn't mean that you actually committed a crime. It might mean you were just accused of something, particularly, things like these minor charges and misdemeanors, but even, like, domestic violence, it's a mandatory arrest in Washington. So it's always a little unclear what really happened and who's to blame and things like that. So yeah, a little bit is just sort of overcoming the stigma with these folks to convince them that, like, this is actually, this is the same population you want to work with. It's not a different one. It's not, they're not bad people. And yeah, those are some of the main challenges.
Well, thank you so much. It is the worst part, to me at least, of the webinar format is, you don't get to have sort of a standing ovation for your comments. So thanks. I really appreciate, this will seed conversations throughout the summer and beyond. So, for those who, I don't think I mentioned it, that Dr. Sherman's actually at a conference and was willing to take time out to talk with us. So I'm just really grateful for that, and hope you have a wonderful conference. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and all of you for listening to me. I was going to say that the worst thing for me about the webinar is not getting to see all of your faces and actually interacting. But I appreciate you being here and taking the time and listening. So
all right.
Enjoy the rest of your conference and
okay.
the work you're doing.
Thank you so much. Thank you.